So let me begin with a disclaimer before I undo it. The disclaimer is, of course, I would not want to argue that Hegel was not a misogynist. That the evidence of the philosophy of right and the philosophy of nature would make that argument ludicrous. My claim, however, is that whatever his general misogyny, that there is no grounds for it in the phenomenology. That the argument of the phenomenology is one that requires, I'm about to demonstrate, that Antigone be the heroine and a representative of the voice of individuality. So my claim, if you remember, was that in burying her brother, the grounds for that was that was the necessary act in order to retrieve his individuality, which had been sacrificed to the nation. And that the nation is, as a war machine, nothing but a system of sacrifice. And that the family enters into it to claim back and give the individual, in the rites of burial, a completeness to that individual life. And that furthermore, in the Hegelian twist, in the act of giving individuality its due, it becomes universal. And what Hegel means by that, other than a funny kind of logical argument, is that it joins the community of the dead. And in the community of the dead is the community of the nation in its moment of absence. So only with burial does both the moment of individuality and the moment of universality get their proper place. What then is... So, Antigone, by being the voice of that, can only be the voice of that, not by simply doing her role-bound duty, which is what she does do. She can only do her role-bound duty by transgressing the law of the state. But the moment she transgresses the law of the state, namely the authority of Creon, do not bury any enemies of the state, she steps outside the family. She goes beyond her role-bound obligation. She individuates herself because she's gone beyond the role assigned to her, right? And becomes the voice of individuality. Indeed, a political voice. And as I suggested last time, and as Henry Zelderback in that in the paper last year, there's all sorts of evidence in the text that the chorus takes her to be a political figure, right? And not just a voice of the family. That is, the citizens back her against Creon, for Creon, they come to regard as a tyrant. Indeed, his son comes to regard him as a tyrant. So my first thesis is that Antigone is the voice of suppressed individuality or singularity. So we need a bit of Hegelian logic here. Hegel operates with three logical categories: universal, particular, and singular. We all kind of know what universal is. So what's the difference between a particular and a singular? A particular is an individual who is wholly saturated in their social role. That is, it is an individual who appears as merely the bearer of a social role and has no identity independently of that social role. So, for example, when you go to church, as I know you all do, and go to confession, which I know you all do regularly, right? It doesn't matter who's on the other side of the screen, right? It is the priest, the individual in their role, that gives you absolution or condemns you to hell, whatever they do, right? And equally, right, when you come to me and I sign your form, it's not because I'm a nice guy, it's because I'm the chair of the department, right? Those are the kinds of acts of a particular and not an individual. So individuality is something that has its own moment for itself and not merely for another. And it's this, I'm suggesting, right, for which the Greeks as yet had no notion, right? So when, people argue the Greeks had no notion of will, or they had no conception of subjectivity, what they mean is there were particulars but no fit individuals. That is, people did not conceive, now we have to ask what that means, they did not conceive of their lives as having an interest or a movement or a significance apart from the roles they played within the larger society. So it's not as if, they didn't have personalities, right? They had personalities, okay, but nonetheless, their weal and woe was role-bound. It's this that Antigone is the voice of. And Hegel is saying that it's the lack of it. So that's one side of his argument, is it's the lack of this that is the ultimate source of the necessary insufficiency of Greek ethical life. But his argument has another side, and the other side is where I'm going to claim it's explicit that the criticisms of him by feminists must be false. And that is, Hegel thinks that what generates what brings to a head the collision, I mean, after all, the notion of particular here, the notion of universal, means that we have nothing but, human and divine law. Hegel says that the other feature of Greek ethical life, indeed the one that made it appear beautiful, is that this functional divide, these are simply two tasks that have to be carried out in society. So these are both, if you want, these are both spiritual notions, right? The divine and the human, right, or family and state, are both spiritual powers. What brings them finally into collapse is equally what makes the original image one of beauty. Namely, that who belongs to which side is dependent upon gender alone. That is, the human is male and the divine is female, which means, for Hegel, that what should be a fully spiritual structure is actually being determined by a naturally given fact, namely gender difference. Hegel agrees there's gender difference, arguing against that. What he's arguing against is, and I'm going to beat this to death by doing every passage where it says this, what he's arguing against is you cannot organize a spiritual totality on the basis of unmediated natural facts. That's the given. And therefore, it is a form of immediacy. Now, it's immediacy, he argues, the immediacy of the natural. So what he's claiming is what makes Greece look pretty, look beautiful, is what nowadays we would call a perfect structure of gender complementarity. Right? But that equally, gender complementarity, is what sinks it. And it sinks it precisely because it's natural and not spiritual. Right? So the fact that Greece is a culture that lacks individuality, this story, right? Remember last week I talked about a culture of reflection versus a culture of immediacy. The fact that it lacks individuality is actually dependent upon its deployment of nature to determine roles. That is, it could not have the immediacy that ignores the moment of individuality and operates merely with particularity unless it was structured, it took some natural fact of the matter, some feature of human anatomy, could have been long noses and short noses, not the one they used, and used that as a spiritual basis. Okay, so now let me give you the passages and beat this idea to death. Just so I know, everyone always thinks when I do this argument I'm making it up. But my argument again is that all the criticisms of Hegel are just consequences of not misreading, of simply not reading. It's just looking at the same 3 or 4 sentences and not looking at any other sentences. So, the bottom of paragraph 465, Hegel says, The ethical consciousness, however, knows what it has to do and has already decided whether to belong to the divine or the human law. So here is, and I use this because this is the moment where there is no reflection. Right? Remember I said reflectiveness means you have to figure out what to do. You have to deliberate. But this is an occasion where there's no deliberation. Well, why don't you have to deliberate? Why don't you have to decide what to do? Because what you have to do is already determined by your anatomy. And that's what he goes on to say. The immediate firmness of decision is something implicit and therefore has at the same time the significance of a natural being as we have seen. Nature, not the accident of circumstances or choice, assigns one sex to one law, the other to the other law. Or conversely, the two ethical powers themselves give themselves an individual existence and actualize themselves in the two sexes. In paragraph 468, he is beginning to talk about the question of guilt and crime. And he's now going to say that the very thing that makes Antigone's action an action and not a deed, not just a doing, but a deed, right? What makes it a deed is that it transgresses a law, is criminal. Which is to say, what's important here? Antigone's action has a moment of negativity about it. But the negativity is not something she intends. The negativity, as it turns out, the very thing that gives that action its ethical weight and historical significance, the very thing, since we know negativity is necessary for individuality, the very thing that individuates her, again, turns out to be a consequence of nature. So he says, roughly in the middle of paragraph 468, middle of page 282, on the contrary, the action is itself this splitting into two. The action is what breaks up, fractures, or to use that Hegelian word, dirents the whole from itself. That you don't know what the whole really is until there's a deed. And the deed reveals the whole as always already antagonistic. But until that deed occurs, that dimension does not occur. It only occurs in the act in which there is a splitting, because these things are shown not to be functionally cooperative, but shown to have a moment of antagonism. On the contrary, the action itself is splitting into this explicit self-affirmation. Notice. Self-affirmation. This is one of those Nietzschean language. Right? So out of this world in which there are only role-bound duties, suddenly there is an act of self-affirmation. And establishing over against itself of an alien external reality, that there is such a reality, this stems from the action itself and results from it. So I take it the notion of self-affirmation is the claim that indeed it's Hegel who thinks that Antigone is establishing herself, right, as an individual, as something like a self. Right? As a relation. Why? Because she relates to herself via what she is not, right? By taking a stand on her difference from the world she inhabits, and therefore not merely being a role bearer. Innocence, therefore, is merely non-action, like the mere being of a stone. That's his judgment of Ismene. Ismene, she's innocent, all right, the way a stone is innocent, right? Not even that of a child. As regards content, however, the ethical action contains the moment of crime because it does not do away with the natural allocation of the two laws to the two sexes. So it's a crime because it fails to overcome this duality and in fact insists upon it. Right? But rather being an undivided attitude towards the law remains within the sphere of natural immediacy, and qua action turns this one-sidedness into guilt by seizing on only one side of the essence and adopting a negative attitude towards the other, that is, violating it. The place in the universal ethical life of guilt and crime, of deeds and actions, will find more definite expression later. About 300 pages later. Chapter on conscience. But clearly, the reason Hegel's flagging this is because he thinks that there is something about the nature of action itself that is at stake in the notions of crime, guilt, and transgression, and evil. That these are not notions that merely represent, and I want to be absolutely clear, these notions cannot merely represent privations of the good. That they have to have more depth, more significance, to be in the very nature of the action, and not just a failure of action. So if after all, to put it another way, if Antigone is the heroine here, she's only a heroine by being a criminal. And that must tell us something about what we think, right, it is to do a significant action in general. And this is what I tried to indicate last week when I mentioned again that Hegel's three models of significant agents are Jesus, Socrates, and Antigone, three civil disobedience. So when we get to conscience, I'm going to try to claim that civil disobedience is in some way for Hegel exemplary of significant action in general. It's actually his model for the meaning of action. Which is a large, perhaps foolish promise. In paragraph 473, here, still on page 285, Hegel says, I'll be quick on this one, on the one side of the content, it is the clash between divine and human law. The youth comes away from the unconscious spirit of the family and becomes the individuality of the community, but that he still belongs to the nature from which he wrenched himself free is evidenced by the fact that he emerges in the contingent form of two brothers, each of whom with equal right take possession of the community
the inequality of the earlier and later birth, an inequality which is a natural difference, has no importance for them when they enter the ethical life of the community. So he's saying, again, against, I thought this is about Polynices and Tocles, this whole thing turns on who came out of the womb before who. That's another example of nature determining the structure of spirit, which here is what generated the war. This was the grounds of the war, the seven against Thebes, right? The disinherited brother, Polynices, is going to, try to get back, his place in the Theban community and take it over and inherit the throne. It's not my fault that my father brother was Oedipus. Okay, I talked about paragraph 475 last time. So my thesis about the ignominious paragraph 475 is that very passage that is the source of the indictment against Hegel is Creon's voice. It's Creon's argument, above all, Creon's argument over and over again against Haman in their dialogue, right, from about line 600 following. Keeps claiming that the problem with Haman is he is being driven by a woman, that womankind is diverting the ends of the state towards private self-interest. That is Creon's argument against Haman. Hegel repeats that argument and then goes on to say, that's right, because womankind here, in exactly the ways I began with, is the voice of individuality. Right? If there had been no women, what would we have? And he tells us in this very paragraph, nothing but people going to war, right? And young men being sacrificed to the state. Boom, gone. No individuality whatsoever. So it's not an accident that at the end of paragraph 475 he goes into the whole story about war again. And that war, and the unburied dead will, undo the state. Finally, the final paragraph, he repeats the nature argument, only now he says explicitly that it's the thesis about nature that is the source of the illusory beauty of Greek ethical life. So, second sentence, this determination of immediacy means that nature as such enters into the ethical act, the reality of which simply reveals the contradiction and the germ of destruction inherent in the beautiful harmony and tranquil equilibrium of ethical spirit itself. For this immediacy has the contradictory meaning of being unconscious tranquility of nature and also the self-conscious restlessness of spirit, etc., etc. Now, one can deepen this thought by thinking a bit further about what the argument of or the structure of the play is like. And here I want to follow the account that is both in H.S. Harris's book, his long commentary, but also in Kimberly Hutchins' book on Hegel and feminism. What is routinely ignored in most accounts of Antigone is that the divine law is, of course, I suggested, the law of the particular. But I also said to you that when we bury the dead, they join the universal, and this is what Hegel says, community of the dead. Well, what universal community? Well, I think the argument here is that the household and the ethical identity of its members, through the divine law, belongs to the Greek community as a whole beyond the specific polis. That is, the divine law is the law of something as Greek, irrespective of which particular Greek polis or tribe. So, in a sense, the divine law is more universal than the human law because it belongs to the whole of Greece. And it makes the city a particular. Conversely, let us remember who Creon is. Creon rules Thebes because he is Jocasta's brother. And Jocasta, just to remind you, was Oedipus's wife. Right? So, roughly when all the bad things happened to Oedipus, right? The next in line turned out not to be his children. They were cursed with him. So the rulership went across to Creon, right? The king's, queen's brother. Which is to say that his kingship depends on family. That he is part of the Theban royal family, and he's, in fact, the closest relative to the dead brothers, apart from Antigone herself and Ismene. So, like the dead brothers who are fighting to inherit the kingship, he also inherited his position. So the entire public sphere here is contaminated by natural blood relationships. It is not some pure, free idea of pure democratic nationhood. So, to put it in a paradoxical formulation, Creon ignores the claims of the ties of blood on which he is nonetheless dependent. Conversely, Antigone's crime ignores the dependency of the divine, of the family, on human law. In fact, you put it another way, it's like Hannah Arendt's arguments about rights. Right? In The Origins of Totalitarianism, Arendt says, when you become a stateless person, and someone says to you, yeah, but you have human rights.
Arendt says, great. What use are human rights without a state to back them up? That is, human rights, indeed any rights, Arendt argues, are idle, empty, useless, probably unreal, unless they are embodied in positive rights of a state which enforces them. So the identity of Polynices as Greek is not a free-floating fact. It depends on him being Theban. That is, you can't just belong to a people, you've got to belong to a people with a particular political organization. This means that the divine and human are not that different structurally. Both, as Hegel says, in a sense, include the whole, but are hence equally one-sided. And they're one-sided again because nature infects both with an unacknowledged contingency and indeed a naive assumption that life can overcome or sublate death. Denies the natural ground of pastness of all community. Okay, now the immediate consequence of this for a theory of action. Let me stop there before saying that theory of action. Any questions about this kind of reading of what Hegel's up to here? I've been bludgeoning you. So just some pointers forward to what I claimed when we began this will be Hegel's conception of the role of retrospection in the theory of action. That is, I began by arguing that part of what's at stake here in Antigone's deed, the doing of something that sets things in motion, right, is we're going to generate a corrigibilist, retrospective account of the meaning of action. And what I mean by that is to claim that what an action is and how it can be mine are comprehensible only through the action itself and what transpires from it. And in saying that, I am arguing against the thesis that because we have prior intentions, and indeed we have a privileged access to what our intentions are, that those intentions or that privileged access determine the meaning and mindness of the action. That is our spontaneous and natural liberal belief. And it's just that Hegel means to be undermining here. So, for me to know what I have done, I have to see what happens. That Antigone, and Antigone's action here is one in which she intends really the burying of her brother and the following of law. She knows, of course, that she's breaking the law that Creon set up. What she does not know, and she admits to not knowing fully, although she never admits guilt, is whether she was right or wrong. So she says, Hegel, by the way, famously misquotes Sophocles. Sophocles has Antigone say, "In suffering, I'll see my action clear." Hegel turns this into, because we suffer, we acknowledge we have erred. And very often, if you hang around Hegelians long enough, you'll think that that's what Sophocles said. Sophocles says, suffering, you're guilty. But what Hegel does want to say is even for Antigone, she gains more and more insight into what she has done and what its stakes are through what happens. Right? That her knowledge of the very thing she has done occurs after the act of burial, through the arguments with Creon, through the backing of the citizens, through the response of Haman, and so on and so forth. Secondly, is the issue of knowing why one does something. Now, on the one hand, and here's the question of, let's call it desire formation. And this has two sides. First, we must come to recognize that our desires are not given, but formed in a personal and collective history. Indeed, formed in part by the structures of society we inhabit. You don't just happen to have the desire to bury your brother. You have that desire only in light of a certain desire formation. So having a desire means coming to acknowledge that formation and taking responsibility for it. That is, it's not merely, the law made me do it. That's exactly what Antigone doesn't do. Rather, she says, that was my duty. I was determined with that desire. And further, I freely acknowledge it. I take a stand on it, and I'd rather die, literally, than to disavow it. So, the thought here, then, is the why of an action is something both in me and not in me, something formed. And the two must be brought together for the desire to become my desire. And often, again, that occurs through retrospection. That is, it's only when I become clear, because of the consequences of the action, that I have to take a stand on the action or disavow it. Now that's what I mean as to do. Can I actually figure out what the desire was
and what my relationship to it was, and hence whether or not I want to call it mine. The mineness of an action doesn't come from me initially doing it. It's again a retrospective taking responsibility for it. So responsibility and regret and agent identity come about through the identifying with or taking a stand on actions, which means on their consequences. And hence, it's through that secondary feature, the taking of a stand, that action come to have what I'm going to call later on an expressive dimension. That is, that they express who I am. That is, the reason why Hegel says that Antigone's act is an act of self-affirmation is because she stakes herself, her identity, who she is, on the doing of that action. Right? So no action need have all those consequences. Again, Antigone could have done it, and then Priam said, you really shouldn't have done it, and she goes, you're right, silly me, come on, Ismene, let's go bake a cake. Right? Now the point here is, who she is different because of her retrospective relationship to the action. So agent identity is not something that is determined prospectively, but only in the retrospective relation to the full consequences of the action as that action is played out in relationship to the rest of the community.
Jay, ask you.
Sure.
Rather than be determined just by the agent's retrospective reflection on the action, isn't the accusation, for example, from Creon or from others and so forth, who say, did you not do this? And then it's only in response, because I do not deny I did what I did,
right,
and so forth, that gets, so it shouldn't say, by the way, I did it, I do not deny that I did it.
Right.
So it's not just, in other words, an autobiographical reflection on one's own.
Oh, no. This isn't going home and thinking about it. Bury your brother, go home. What did I do today? No, when I say it's the relation of the consequences, I mean the whole set of consequences, including that one is called to account, is called guilty, or called innocent, right? It's all of that. And so the retrospection is, in part, process. It's the continuing way in which you relate to the action, and that is in part what determines what the action was and its moneyness. So mindness turns out to be a complicated social practice. I think this is, let's stop for a second and think about other accounts of mindness, right? Usually, an action is mine because if you're an analytic philosopher, because you have a belief in a desire, and they hook up, and that's it. So it's just a belief-desire set that happens to happen to this body. That's the mindness of an action. Or the mindness of an action occurs because you did it intentionally, right? That you acted with purpose. Kant began to worry about the mindness of an action. And he was worried that, well, how do I know that my desires are mine? Right? And Kant insisted over and over again. This way Kant is very Freudian. He kept saying, we actually don't know what our desires or motives are. So what we need to do to make them mine is to take something So it's not the having of a desire that makes it a reason for action. It's taking that desire and saying that it trumps every other desire, and furthermore, and now here's the real bit for me, I can be certain that I am not being determined by that desire if it's compatible with the moral law. The moral law is what lifts action out of nature and makes the idea that it is truly mine and not the voice of nature speaking through me the action. So mineness for Kant turns out to be the same as free, and free only if done in accordance with the moral law. Heidegger has a different worry about mindness. Right? He's worried that when I'm acting, it's really das Mann who's acting. I think I'm talking about Antigone, but it's really, this group and that group. And in order for me to be really talking about Antigone, for my actions here to be mine, I have to have a being towards death. Right? Because only a being towards death is the non-substitutable relation, to the random nothingness on which I stand, individuates me. So the whole question of being in time is really about the mindness of action. And my view about the Heideggerian analysis is it's a bit of magic. Right? I just think about my death. I will make it mine. I don't have to do anything else. Well, no, it's a form. I wanted to put it this way because, like Kant, it's a formalism. Right? The notion of authenticity is it's a form or a manner. Being towards death is a certain attitude or relation. But none of them have what I'm calling necessary, namely the full weight of retrospectivity. Right? What they all want, and this is the delusion, they all want to be certain now that my action is mine. Heidegger, of all people, tries to empty action of its inherent quality of being a synthesis of the temporal modalities. Right? He wants to, as it were, sew up the future here and now. Can't be done. So this is going to be, I want to suggest, a continuing weight on how we can have a theory of action which has the weight of retrospectivity, and what kind of, and this is, I take Hegel's question, what kind of community must we inhabit if this is going to run? All of this, he thinks, is implied by Antigone. Antigone introduces the notion of a different notion of action. And after all, just think about it in terms of just not in a complex way, but we often talk about tragic irony. Things happening as the reverse of what was anticipated. Now, our notion of tragedy is exactly about the way in which we cannot understand action through the notion of control. That tragedy is an awareness of the depth of human experience that exceeds our powers of control, and how we are called to take responsibility for what we did not intentionally do. And of course, that's the way in which the retrospective theory of action is going to differ from the liberal theory of action. And this is something that Hegel beats to death, ironically, in his
aesthetics more than anywhere else. The liberal notion of action, and Hegel says, we probably need this for our courts and law. We're only responsible for what we intend. And other things are just, we could not foresee them, then we're not responsible. Oedipus never intended to commit parricide or incest. But he takes complete and absolute responsibility. There is nothing he could have done to foresee those actions. No bit of deliberation, no bit of... He didn't lack some knowledge he should have had. He wasn't drunk when he killed his... None of that, no excuses, right, that are of the reasonable kind. But he was completely ignorant of what he was doing, and you might say that is mitigating. He does not accept the mitigation for a second. He thinks that is what he did, and therefore he must take full responsibility. Yeah?
But can we draw that comparison between Oedipus and, say, a contemporary theory of action when Oedipus's relationship towards his guilt is in some sense conditioned by the Greek conception of rolled-down identity, which doesn't have its...
It's not going to matter because, where the debates happen, the famous debate in Anglo-American theories of action is over the role of moral luck. And Bernard Williams and Thomas Nagel have kind of famous debate about this, and the debate's been rumbling on. But the argument is really about what the significance of consequences are for us as agents. So even if there are unforeseen consequences, the Hegelian argument is, in some sense, I may not be legally responsible, but I will be responsible. And to disown responsibility is simply to try to chop my action up into its intended bits and its unintended bits, as if actions don't always, routinely, have unintended consequences. But if actions routinely have unintended consequences, then we can't have a theory of responsibility, above all a theory of moral responsibility, that's simply narrowly based in intention. So, I do something, I didn't intend harm, I cause harm, I try to make reparations. I apologize. I couldn't see that coming, but I'm really sorry. Is there any way I can make it up to you? The fact that I don't intend it doesn't stop me being connected to those consequences. Right? That is, as it were, only someone who was worried about a litigious society in which they want to disclaim as much responsibility as they can and don't want to get sued for anything is going to have a good reason to try to draw the line in that hard and fast way. And I'm suggesting to you it's inhuman. It's not the way we're connected to one another. Right? If every time I did something, we all exist in close, we have friends, lovers. We do unintended wrongs all the time. We apologize. Not because we've done wrong, but because we've caused harm. Right? The causing harm is enough for us to apologize. If you say, look, I'm sorry it was your favorite dress, I'm sorry I burnt it, I'm sorry it'll never happen again, but I didn't mean it. Tough luck. something's gone wrong here. Something's gone wrong. So we have, and it's very hard. Hegel is really asking us to think differently about how we identify and individuate actions. And he's saying we can't lock it in. Yeah?
I mean, just to pick up on that thought, though, I mean, it's interesting that if and I think it's right, that Hegel has tragedy in mind here. Tragedy is a discourse that's apology-free. I mean, so it's not as though, I understand, of course, that apology would be a way of understanding how our actions have unintended consequences, but that doesn't seem to be what's at stake in Oedipus or Antigone. That it's not about an acknowledgement of guilt or admission of responsibility or any of these things, although I see how those are different from other theories of action in the way that Hegel says. Instead, it seems, if I'm right, I mean, partly, just even looking at Aristotle, it has to do with the way in which one owns up to one's story, to one's history. And it's simply that. So not for the sake of responsibility, not for the sake of exculpation, not for the sake of excusing oneself to one's loved ones or anything like that.
Right.
You know, Oedipus doesn't say sorry, kids. You know, it's
on the contrary.
Right. On the contrary. So,
but he does tear his eyes out.
out.
He feels bad. So I'm suggesting, and of course, not all the elements of the story are available here.
Antigone to walking around. I mean, it's
right. Yeah. No, not all the elements of the story are available here, which is why the book can end here, right? So we don't have all the elements for a full retrospective theory of action. What tragedy does is underline how deeply unintended consequences belong to an action and can't be thought of as a category apart. If they're a category apart, then again, there's no tragedy. There's just a lot of people going to the courts all the time. Just a crazy litigious society. Okay, let's, I can see you're pondering. So keep pondering. Let's have a little break. And we'll quickly do the Roman world and the absolutist state and do a whole bunch of stuff quick. We're getting way behind, I think. Are we way behind? We're probably way behind. My last bit of evidence that Hegel intends us to be reading Antigone in this way is that he thinks the Roman legal world is the solution. So what's the Roman legal world and why is it a solution? Or what's a solution to? It's not going to be a solution to individuality. It's going to be a solution to the problem of nature. And the solution to the problem of nature is to generate a different conception of what it is to be a person. So what we need is an account of what it is to be an agent or a person that systematically avoids the idea of a sexual division of labor in action. And the way in which Rome does this is that we socialize and equalize our standing as individuals by becoming legal persons. So it's the idea of the legal person that Hegel thinks is the great invention of the Roman world. And to be a person in this setting is to have a position in a private sphere, to be self-interested, but above all, to be someone whose basic domain of action is legally protected. That is, to be a legal person is to be recognized by others as a legal person, where the notion of person is an abstract category. Indeed, Hegel wants to argue that the notion of the legal person is the beginning of the modern notion of the self or subject. The notion of self or subject is not a Cartesian invention, but a certain elaboration of the Roman notion of legal personhood. And what defines legal personhood is being the bearer of certain rights. Above all, the rights to own, use, and alienate property. That is, the crux of a legal person is it someone who is entitled to buy, own, inherit, use, alienate, sell, and exchange property. And this is, of course, that's what defines a person. It doesn't matter about your gender or your role, be a man or a woman. As we know, even corporations are legal persons. You don't even need to be a body. Skip that for the moment. But this is the origin of the idea that becomes, and we have to think a bit about what this means and why it happens. We know at the very beginning of early modern philosophy, in all of the early modern philosophers' account of political philosophy, property owning and personhood are coextensive. And it often, if you came in my generation and you read a lot of C.B. Macpherson, it's always thought that this is the problem of capitalism. But I think that moves too quick. That is, to understand the problem of legal personhood simply through the notion of capital is a mistake. Capital universalizes the idea of legal personhood and gives it a certain kind of role. It didn't invent it, and it doesn't fully explain its significance. Well, how are we to understand that significance? Well, think of the problem here as having a sphere of ownness. Why should Kant, let's do it through Kant. Why should Kant think? The very first thing that happens in Kant is he claims there has to be a right to have property. Why? Well, he means to be asking the question, when he brings up the question of property, of under what conditions can I be free? And the first thing he says is, I can be free only if I can actually first have control over my own body. That is, if I can be free to move my own body and not have my body moved by others. So I have to have an integrity of body. But the next step, which in convoluted across it. It's very odd. It's this whole story about the earth is round and limited. And then what? I have to be free to move. Let's say by move I mean take a step. Well, under what conditions can I take a step? Well, I can take a step only if someone else doesn't already own that land. If someone else already has control over that land, then I can't even take a step. So the first thought is that not only must I have control over my own body, but I must, in order even to have a minimum freedom of movement, have the freedom to call mine certain things that are not physically attached to me. A piece of chalk. Well, in order for me to use it, I have to be able to have control over it. But what if we have no laws of property, then everyone wants my piece of chalk, and it's no good to me. So in order to actually use my body, in order to make use of any goods, I have to have control over them. So it means that in order to have any relationship to the world at all, I have to have control over a range of objects and space that other people recognize as mine. That is, my freedom can't stop when my body stops, because if it did, I wouldn't be able to move. My freedom requires that others recognize my entitlement to use certain objects that are not immediately attached to me at this moment as nonetheless mine. And furthermore, that there are other bits of the world that we share and belong to no one. That is, even to have a minimal idea of freedom of action requires some theory of property and of property rights. And property rights are nothing if they're not recognized by others. That is, what it is to have a right, by definition, I want to argue, is to be recognized by others as having certain entitlements. Now, having those entitlements, the Romans decided, is just what it is to be a person. So, although they introduced the notion of legal personhood in order to try to, well, I guess the simplest way to express it is, I think what was at stake is they were trying to denaturalize the notions of matrilineal and patrilineal descent. That they were trying to generate a society in which the movement of property could be done by choice rather than by nature. Now, by calling it a person, so the thought becomes, to be a person is to be recognized as a person, and to be recognized as a person is not simply to be recognized as having certain features that people have and butterflies don't. it's to be accorded certain rights, above all, property rights. And this breaks the grip of the notion of nature with respect to one's relationship to those objects that are necessary for everyday life. Now, of course, this is a very, very abstract notion of a person. It is just up there in that. That's why a corporation can be a person, right? It's really nothing but a series of entitlements and protection of those entitlements, which is why Hegel thinks that this notion of personhood goes along with Stoicism, that also thought of the person as inhabiting a series of abstractions. So Stoicism and the notion of legal personhood abstracts the self and uses pure categories of thought and supposes that those pure categories of thought are sufficient accounts of the relationship between self and world. Hence, he just reminds us of his earlier account of Rome when he calls Rome the boredom of the world. Level of abstraction. Now, clearly the notion of legal personhood is insufficient on its own. Civil society, which is what we're talking about here, must be grounded in something larger, namely the state, for it is the responsibility of the state to protect and enforce rights. Not just having those rights, those belong to us as members of civil society, but only a state can protect them. Hegel contends, and it's just a very fast, sloppy argument, that the emperor stood immediately for the sovereignty of the state. Now, having that notion of an emperor and that notion of sovereignty of the state means that there is a two-sidedness to the notion of the state here. The state, on the one hand, is the necessary ground and protector of rights, and it is also, because it is itself independent of those rights, a tyrant and tyrannical. That is, the emperor is, you might say, as abstract as a version of the state, as the notion of legal personhood is abstract as a theory of civil society. Or to put it another way, without community or solidarity or a concept of the nation, the state is just as isolated and empty as the legal person. So Hegel's little speculative structure here means to say that Greece is a version of community without individuality, while Rome is a vision of individuality without community.
On that question,
Yeah.
how is the account of Rome that he gives there any different if it is from Hobbes?
It isn't. And we're going to see, in fact, that the next bit of the argument, which is about first the transition from the late Middle Ages into the absolutist state, runs exactly the same Hobbesian doubt about that divine right-based theory of the state, which will give us the absolutist state. I mean, he'll run the whole same series of arguments. On a lot of these matters, he's just in agreement with Hobbes, and not surprisingly, because, one of the people tend to read Hobbes ideologically and not historically. But Hobbes is the great modernizer. The goal of Hobbes is consistently to try to blow the whistle on outmoded and illusory forms of sociality and to try to look at the already existing realities that are governing those structures and saying that we must reconstruct our political life in accordance with those socio and political realities, namely the realities of power. So no, I don't think there's... And of course, the other thing is Hobbes is a nominalist. He's a great critique of Platonic illusionism or various forms of rationalism. And with that, too, Hegel is going to agree. Right? Nominalism is a uncontrolled version of a theory of negativity. The problem with Hobbes is not his nominalism, it's that there's only his nominalism, right? There's no way of reining it in. It's both his genius and his weakness. So, no, I have... I think the diagnosis of Rome is just the same. And I think that the diagnosis of the late Middle Ages, the early modern state, was just the same. Okay, so I think the only other thing I want to say about here, and we'll just move to the account of culture, is it's simply worth remembering that our Grecophilia tends to blind us to the fact that the heart of almost all modern philosophy is Roman and above all Stoic. That above all the conception of the self that you find in Descartes and Kant is fundamentally Stoic. And by Stoic, I mean, we're just talking about the liberal notion of action. But actually, the best way to think about it, that is Stoicism, right? Because Stoicism is really about the limits of human control over the world. So Stoicism is a identification of the self with only what is under its immediate control. Right? And it turned out that this was a good thing for both capitalism and liberalism. That is, to have this idea of identifying the self with the area of immediate control. But it's a fundamentally Stoic idea. So both the inwardness of modernity, the fact of individualism and its forms of isolation, its conception of ethicality, and, as I've just hinted at, liberalism itself all strike me as fundamentally Stoic doctrines. And to say that they're Stoic is in part to say they mean to do away with the category of the tragic. The next stretch of argument. Any questions about that? It's a bizarre. After that long account of Greece, you get kind of 3 pages on Rome. But that's what it is. And it's just for the sake of the notion of legal person.
Is that, just to pick up on what you just said, that what's at stake here is a disavowal of overcoming this proceeding of tragedy. To what extent does is the thought that personhood, selfhood in this way is a fundamentally non-tragic form of existence that is incompatible precisely because of its attachment to property, all the things you just outlined?
All those things,
That
and
forecloses tragedy.
it means to foreclose tragedy, but it means to do so by, on the one hand, the conception of the person, but the idea of the abstraction of the person from its bonds in community. That is, it just looks at community strictly in terms of the notion of right and nothing else, right? And therefore loses any notion in which one might be a member of a community other than by having certain rights. So it's the thinning out of that, and hence the losing of self-determination, the losing of past, all those other questions. Okay, let me just do the transition to the next bit, and we'll stop. Let me begin again with a certain kind of disclaimer. The next section, the section on culture, is the only place in the Phenomenology where Hegel discusses alienation. And indeed, it's the only place in the Phenomenology, he claims, where there really is alienation. And I mention this because there are dozens of books on Hegel that claim the whole of history and the whole of Hegel is nothing but a history of alienation. So in the kind of neo-Fichtean readings of Hegel, like Charles Taylor, he even says, spirit alienates itself into the world and then goes through this whole process until it can gather itself up again. And I want to say emphatically that Hegel thinks that alienation is a far narrower structure than that, and he does not think it is a general key to the structure of his thinking as a whole. Of course, Hegel does think that we must objectify ourselves in order to participate in a form of life, but for the most part, he thinks that it is presupposed by us that when we participate in a form of life, what we are doing, as he says over and over again, is our own work and the work of the society. That these things fall apart at various moments, of course, does occur, but this is not a structure of alienation. These are simply inadequate forms of social life in various ways. What we're going to find here in this account of early modern Europe is a particular kind of uncertainty about the relationship between self and culture. So culture is the other word that he's introducing here. Bildung. And Bildung in this stretch of argument is going to have all the various meanings that it can have. That is, Bildung is a process of education. It's a process of formation. It is a process of which one acquires certain cultural standing by going through a certain process of education and formation. And in the case we're going to be looking at, this is going to be happening consciously, which is the big deal here. This is why he's calling the whole section culture. That is, Hegel takes it for granted that typically Bildung, the process of formation and reformation of the self into a social being, operates behind the back of social formations. That forming and reforming of natural consciousness and its world are ever-present aspects of social life, but at this particular juncture, they are going to become conscious. And this is going to be explicit in the sense that one is here to cultivate oneself to nobility, above all to the aristocratic virtues of honor and the like, to become an honorable person, and to avoid, above all, being base. So he's interested in that moment, which is just at the moment where the Middle Ages are dying, and the modern world is beginning to take hold, and that these new quasi-secular beings are trying to find a language or a set of terms in order to discriminate their form of life and what belongs to it. And the notion of being an honorable man, having honor, is this new notion. And the thought here is that these virtues are externally set standards of behavior that face the self. So, since warfare and risking death for glory are both the means and criteria of nobility, then we are here perceiving another explicit historical version of the master-slave dialectic. That is, where certain people, knights and all these kind of guys, seek to be noble, and people who avoid it are cowards and base, or even worse, if they try to make a living and make money, they're really base. So the period we're now discussing is something like early modern Europe, the 15 and 1600s, and it's here with the emergence of the state and with its contrasting other civil society, which is the idea of an autonomous economy. So the dialectic of nobility and baseness is simultaneously going to be that of the dialectic between state and civil society. And just to remind you, just so you can see the thread here, right? We started with the question of nation and family, right? And that's because there wasn't an autonomous economic sphere, right? So we had the state and its other, the family. We moved into the Roman world, where we get a developed civil society, and then the notion of empire and the state. So, thematically, Hegel is wanting to argue that the fundamental structures necessary for understanding ourselves as living in a modern society are going to be, above all, state and civil society. And we have to make sense of our habitation of these two realms, in which, rough and readily, the state is going to be the representative of universality, and civil society is going to be representative of the interests of particularity. So, if we want to do it this way, and my argument is a set of considerations here, and the sort of worries that Hegel is going to be discussing is, of course, almost identical to those that Marx discusses in the Jewish History, which I think to be still probably along the philosophy of right, the most fullest account of the interdependent dialectic between state and civil society. So if we go back and use slightly Antigone-like categories to think about this, we can think of civil society as still the moment of nature, if we want, and the state as the moment of culture. The state is going to be the representation of our general interest, or the universal. And therefore, civil society is going to be the notion of self-interest. We've already claimed that we have to have some self-interest. That was the whole point of the Antigone, that the general interest is going to be about, above all, state power. What do you think goes here? What's the contrast with state power in the world of civil society?
Rights. Will. Will.
Not will. What do you need lots of to get along here? Wealth. That's the form of power that belongs. I mean, this is a very realistic account. Hegel isn't trying to fudge here, right? And then in the initial coding of all of this is going to be good or noble, right? And this stuff is going to be bad and base. And then what we're going to find is how these things reverse themselves, right? How you can't, as it were, pull them apart. So the ignoble, it represents subordination to the state, and the state despises the wealth it nonetheless seeks. That's the initial scenario that Hegel is interested in. And when I mentioned earlier that Hobbes is going to run a similar argument here, what Hobbes wants to know, and what Hegel wants to know, is what this notion of good and noble is apart from power and wealth. And of course what Hobbes is going to argue is nothing. Nothing. Can't do it. Okay. So what Hegel thinks, and I'll end with this thought, we'll pick up here next week. Certainly for next week, read certainly the stuff on the Enlightenment and utilitarianism. Maybe we'll get to the beginning of the French Revolution. We'll just see how it goes. What Hegel thinks about nobility and baseness is that, and this is where I want to begin with the thought, he's thinking that these are ideological reflections of these structural realities. Right? That's why I claim that he's Hobbesian in his impulses here. Right? That this structure, and since state and civil society are still with us, then it is tempting to read really the whole rest of the book as trying to think about what kind of conceptions of self we require if we are to belong to a world that is structured like this. How can we make sense of these structures in fundamentally satisfactory human terms? That is, what's wrong with these is these are mere ideological covers for these phenomena and don't get at the human reality. And the human reality is we have to have some notion of an interest that is more than our individual self-interest as the ground for self-interest, but yet there is no general interest without really self-interested individuals who want to have satisfaction in their doings in the world. So, state power and wealth are the mechanisms, the human phenomena that Hegel's interested in is this stuff, which, lo and behold, are simply our old friends of universality and particularity again, only now structured along new lines. So the question now is, under modern circumstances, how do we need to think about those moments? And Hegel's going to argue that the movement from here to the absolutist state to the Enlightenment critique of the absolutist state to the hope of, let's call it an Enlightenment utopia, otherwise called the French Revolution, to German moral philosophy, is the working out of this structure as a way of thinking about who we essentially are. Let me stop there.